Greetings to everybody. Now we are going to start our 40th intergenerational meeting. Today, our guest is a dear friend from Boston, Sheldon Benjamin, and we have Ferhat Hüseyinov to moderate this session. He is also, Ferhat is a member of SEED and is a recent graduate, recent MD, and now he is also in Boston. It's an interesting coincidence. I don't know how many people we will have in the live session, but I hope those who will be watching on YouTube, we assume there will be a few others, will continue this uh, training session, education session. Now, may I leave the floor for Ferhat to start the moderation, please? Welcome, Sheldon.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi to everyone. My name is Farhat. Thank you for introduction, Dr. Blunt. And yeah, I want to welcome Dr. Sheldon. He's gonna present the 6 neuropsychiatric cases today, and I think it's really important. I also like check Dr. Sheldon's articles related to like cases, and I can say that I am really inspired actually by like Oliver Sacks and like his narrative style, and I think it's really important to talk about cases and like to see their relevance in our daily practice. I'm just gonna give like brief information about Dr. Sheldon. He is professor of psychiatry and neurology and doctor of neuropsychiatry, associate director of psychiatry residency at the University of Massachusetts Chan School of Medicine, and he is board certified in psychiatry, neurology, and neuropsychiatry. And is director of American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and is secretary of the International Neuropsychiatric Association. His lectures and published are widely in neuropsychiatry. I just don't want to like say all like information, but we are so glad that you're here. And yeah, stage is yours, and we are here to listen to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Farhad, and thank you very much, Bulent, for the invitation. And thank you, Darren, for coming in person. This is for you. If people happen to see it later on YouTube, good for them, but you should feel free to ask anything you like.
Okay.
Let's start here. So this is our topic. And you probably know that case reports have fallen into disfavor in the era of clinical trials. It's just the way things are now. No one is interested in case reports. But a well-investigated case report with good pathological or laboratory correlation in the past has driven our field forward. And so I'm going to talk about 6 neuropsychiatry case reports that are important for anyone in mental health to know about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the people who preserved the cases because they knew we would continue to learn from them. And so we're going to be talking about Phineas Gage, Tintin, Frau D, someone named S, sometimes in Russia known as Sh, someone named JP, and of course HM. Those are the way they're all known in the literature. But before we get started, disclosures. I have a small publishing company. We don't make any money. Our goal is to break even, but it is a neuropsychiatry publishing company, so I have to call it as a conflict. I don't have anything to do with pharma or with industry. I do receive a small stipend check because of being a director of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. In 2018, we published this paper. And the reason we did it is we put a team together to try to create a single resource that would have the most important case reports in neuropsychiatric history so that a student of neuropsychiatry or a student of psychiatry who was interested in sort of getting a quick tutorial on these cases would find them in one place. We made a list of what we thought could be the most important case reports. We vetted it with 10 very well-known neuropsychiatrists, behavioral neurologists, neuropsychologists, and a medical historian to see their opinions and narrowed the list down to these 6 cases. To the extent possible, we used primary sources rather than recent literature, meaning we tried to find, even if it's going back 100 years, we tried to find the original reports to try to understand the actual stories as they were, because things changed a lot in the literature. So the story begins in the year 1848, not far from where I am right now, about a 4-hour drive by automobile to the north in the state of Vermont, in the town of Cavendish. On Wednesday afternoon, September the 13th, 1848, the weather was mild, and a 25-year-old efficient and capable foreman named Phineas Gage was blasting rock for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. Now, in 1848, you'll pardon me throughout this whole talk, I'm going to mention what's going on in the world, right? So in 1848, there was not yet a standard for the tracks that railroad trains ran on. So each company would build a short line of railroad that might require trains that wouldn't fit on some other company's railroad track. But in 1848, there were what were called short line railroads. And Gage was actually, he had a small private company, I guess you would say, for blasting rock away. And he would make a bid on a job. He would figure out how much money to charge. He would hire men to do the work, buy his supplies. And if he had good executive function, he'd make a profit. So he was pretty good at this. Let me just make an adjustment here if I can to here. There. I just want to, there. Let's go there. So this is the place in Cavendish, Vermont. I went up to the site where the red arrow is where Gage was sitting on that rocky outcropping. That's me, by the way, some years ago. I'm holding in my hand an exact copy of an iron rod that Gage was using. It's called a tamping iron. It was 109 centimeters long, 3.2 centimeters at the base, and just a half centimeter at the tip. It weighed 6 kilograms, and its purpose was to use the bigger side to pound down the sand before blasting a hole, and the other side was to pry rocks and things. So remember, in 1848, dynamite had not yet been invented, and blasting caps had not yet been invented. So they used something called black powder. First, someone would take a big drill, 6 feet long, and they would drill a hole in the rock. Then, after the hole was drilled, someone would pour black powder, that's explosive gunpowder, I guess, into the hole. They would take a gunpowder fuse and put it in. They would pour in sand on top and then use this tamping iron to pound down the sand. Then they would light the fuse and from a distance and blow up the rock. So Gage was seated, pounding on the sand. The gentleman sitting opposite him or standing opposite him, his job was to put the sand in. He was also the one who put the blasting powder in. Gage is standing ready to pound on the sand when someone calls from behind him, "Hey, Phineas." He turns his head to the right, looks back, and brings the tamping iron down into the hole, expecting that there would be sand in there. And this is a rocky area. Vermont has got mountains and rocks. And now the guy who was supposed to put the sand in also looked up when the person standing behind Gage called his name. And so the sand didn't go into the hole. Gage brings the iron down. It strikes a spark, explodes the blasting powder, and the tamping iron flies in through Gage's cheek, out his head, and goes 15 meters behind him and falls to the ground. Needless to say, Gage was stunned. He didn't pass out. He didn't lose consciousness, but he was stunned. This is what it looked like. I'm going to do that again because you weren't expecting it. This is a reconstruction from the New England Journal of Medicine of what the blast looked like. Watch it go through. Now, we measured the skull and we measured the tamping iron. The zygomatic arch covering here, covering the here's the zygomatic arch. The space behind it is exactly the width of the tamping iron. So it goes through his left frontal lobe and comes out. He ends up losing his eye, but besides that, he didn't do too badly. So the tamping iron comes to rest behind him. He has a few brief impact convulsions. Those are not of particularly important in neurology, but his arms and legs jerk once or twice, but then he's awake. His men brought an ox cart and lifted him onto it, and he was sitting upright for the journey of about 1 kilometer back to the hotel he was staying in, the Adams Hotel. He got down from the cart on his own power, walked up onto the piazza of the hotel, sat down in one of the chairs, and they sent for the town doctor. The town doctor was a Dr. Edward Williams. So 30 minutes after the explosion, Williams meets Gage on the piazza of the Adams Hotel, and Gage smiles at him and says, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." He figured that something bad had happened. He didn't know how bad it was. It was Phineas Gage who had the first described case of the behavior changes that take place when the frontal lobe is severely damaged. Well, Edward Williams took care of him. They walked up a narrow flight of stairs together to Gage's bedroom, and he took care of him until John Harlow, the railroad physician, arrived about 90 minutes after the accident. But let's take a look at the year 1848 for a moment. Prior to 1848, in the early part of the 19th century, phrenology was was all the rage in Europe and even in the United States. Phrenology, in a way, was the beginning of localization in the brain. Prior to that, I'd say that families were blamed for their children's mental illness, and mentally ill people were treated like criminals. But what did phrenology was a pseudoscience. It turned out not to have any basis in science. However, it did say that, no, this is not the parents' fault. It has something to do with the shape of your brain. Well, Pierre Florenz in Europe was saying this localization business is nonsense. He was arguing against phrenology in that very year, 1848. The stethoscope had just been invented not that long beforehand by René Laennec. And here in Boston, 2 years before, the first ether anesthesia had happened at the Ether Dome at Massachusetts General Hospital. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan was Abdülmecid the first. This is a gift for you guys in Turkey so that we can anchor this in time. But in the United States, the gold rush of California was starting and people were going west to try to make their fortunes. This is Dr. Harlow. After he examines Gage, he publishes this report in the local Boston Medical Journal saying this incredible thing has happened. This rod is blasted through Gage's head, and yet he has no deficits. He's able to walk, etc. And he claims that it's completely no deficits. Well, another doctor at Harvard, a surgeon, Henry Jacob Bigelow, says, "I don't think so. I don't believe this happened." And so he was a skeptic, and he went and talked with Harlow and said, "I'd like to try to prove this." He gathered evidence as he could. Here is one of the things he got from the owner of the hotel where Gage was staying. And this is in 1849, a year after the accident. He writes this to certify that Phineas Gage had boarded in my house for several weeks previous to being injured on the railroad, and that I saw him and conversed with him soon after the accident. And I'm of the opinion that he was perfectly conscious of what was passing around him. He rode to the house 3/4 of a mile, that's a kilometer, sitting in a cart, and walked from the cart into the piazza and thence up the stairs with but little assistance. So he was satisfied that this really happened and went on to study Gage as well. Meanwhile, this was published in 1869, 20 years, 21 years after the injury. Harlow publishes the first description of frontal lobe behavior dysfunction. And here it is, a very famous description about Phineas Gage. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when conflicting with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate. You'll have to look that up in the dictionary, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operation no sooner arranged than abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. In this regard, his mind was radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. Now, this was 21 years after the injury. Remember, the first case report said he has no deficits. Now, 21 years later, Harlow is saying he has this behavior change. We're told that Gage turned into a disinhibited, childish, kind of antisocial fellow. That's what it says in a lot of psychology books. And we're left with the impression that he stayed that way. And this, by the way, is a daguerreotype of Gage, so you can see him with his eyes sewn shut, holding his tamping iron as he liked to do. He's a very handsome guy. But this is perhaps the most distorted case in medical history. It's true he could no longer work as the foreman of a blasting crew. He was able to find work, though, at some stables nearby at an inn, and he learned to drive what was called a Concord coach, a stagecoach with several horses. And he was planning to accompany his family to California so they could try looking for gold in the gold rush. But he agreed to drop off an order of stagecoaches in Chile on the way. Remember, the Panama Canal had not yet been built. It won't come around for another 65 years. So that means to go from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States by boat, one had to go all the way around the tip of South America and come back up north. This is the hotel where Gage worked in New Hampshire, about 2.5 hours north of here at Courier's Hotel. That's where he worked in the stable. And after his injury, he tried at first to make a living exhibiting himself. The picture on the lower left is P.T. Barnum's American Museum, where he would get a few pennies every time the curtain was opened, and he would tell his story of his injury. And I found this handbill. I found it in a archive in Vermont that apparently he gave a lecture trying to make money that way. For only 12.5 pennies, he would tell his story of how he survived the iron bar coming through his head. Well, this is the kind of stagecoach that he drove. And I would ask you, how could a man who permanently lacks frontal and executive function do what Gage did? This is called a coach and four. This is a Concord coach being drawn by 4 horses. I don't know your backgrounds. I was from the middle United States, the Midwest, and I always rode horses as a child. You drive a horse with 2 leather reins. You pull on the right one to make it go to the right. You pull on the left to make it go to the left. Now he actually drove a coach with 6 horses, and in order to control that stagecoach, he would have to separate the reins, and you would allow the horses on the inside to go a different speed than the horses on the outside if you're making a curve, so that the ones on the outside have to go a little faster and the ones on the inside a little slower. He was able to do this. So he got bored on the boat to California, got off in Chile, and decided he would live there for 8 years, and he made a living there driving stagecoach. He drove on the Valparaiso-Santiago line. And if you go to Google Maps and click on stagecoach like I did, you'll see it was a 13-hour trip. It was 94.6 miles. It's a long trip. So that's 160 kilometers or so. And he did this 6 days a week, every day, He arrived at work at 4 o'clock in the morning, charged a $10 fare, loaded the luggage, stopped when they needed a break for the to go outside and use the facilities or whatever. And he did this dependably for 7 years in Chile. Is that the work of somebody with no frontal function? I don't think so. He obviously recovered somewhat. So this was the first description of behavioral changes associated with frontal damage. And the description was influenced, nevertheless, by whatever the medical belief of the time was. In 1848, it was severe brain damage with little deficit. But in 1869, it was brain damage that produced personality change. And even today, you can look in any psychology book and find lies about Phineas Gage. He certainly was not a sociopath. He certainly was not a bad person. He was a good babysitter for his niece and nephews and liked to tell stories to children and things like that. But Dr. Harlow knew that his patient's case was important and decided to save the tamping iron and the skull for us to examine. However, Gage recovered a surprising amount of executive and prefrontal function. And Harlow, of course, kept this for us to study. That's all the time we have in 1848. We have to run into the 1860s and introduce you to a patient named Tantan. Now, we don't know what he looked like. This is his brain. The year was 1861, 13 years after Dr. Harlow met Gage. A doctor in France named Paul Broca heard about a patient known as Tantan. Tantan was actually Louis-Victor Le Borgnier, and Louis-Victor Le Borgnier had been transferred to the surgical ward of the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris for the treatment of gangrene of his right leg. Broca noted that he had expressive aphemia. That was what aphasia was called before Sigmund Freud changed the language to aphemia. Or it was called aphemia before Sigmund Freud changed it to aphasia, excuse me. And he had intact auditory comprehension despite his inability to speak. Le Borgnier had begun having seizures at 24 years old, and by 30 could no longer speak, and his family wouldn't support him. Louis Maurice de Belém was the prefecture of police in Paris, and he was something of a humanitarian. He arranged for the patient to be admitted to the Bicêtre Hospital. Tan's right hemiparesis gradually increased, and he died of infection at the age of 50, only 6 days after meeting Paul Broca. So let's look at the year 1861, when, by the way, Abdulaziz was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Only a few years earlier in France, Gratiolet had said the brain must be divided into lobes, that somehow we should think of these as separate lobes. That was the year that Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. And it was only 4 years earlier that Louis Pasteur had shown that germs cause disease. It was also 4 years earlier that the very first treatments for epilepsy were introduced by James Locock, physician to the Queen of England, who popularized bromide treatment for epilepsy. And The Origin of Species had only been published by Charles Darwin 2 years earlier. Now, Broca is generally credited with determining that language is lateralized to the left hemisphere because of this and other studies he did. But initially, Broca had presented the case of By the way, Tantan was called Tantan, you should know this, because the only thing he could say was the syllable tan. You could ask him, "How are you doing, Mr. Le Borgnier?" And he would say, "Tan, tan, tan, tan." And so he became known as Tan in the literature. So initially, Broca presented Tan in an argument that the cerebral convolutions, the gyri, should be considered as functional groups. If gyri were near one another, perhaps they worked together on the same function. He was not the first one to propose language localization. He just was the first one to bring proof to the language localization debate. He was also not the first one to propose asymmetry of cognitive functions in the brain. Mark Dax had proposed this 25 years before Broca. But he was a believer in Linneck's anatomical pathological method, where careful examination correlating symptoms with pathology would lead to understanding of disease. So Broca was not the first to propose brain lateralization. A man named Jean-Baptiste Bouillot in 1824 proposed that brain function and language must be lateralized. And in 1848, the year of the Gage explosion, Bouillot says, I will pay 500 francs to anyone who can show me the brain of a person who has suffered an acquired speech impairment who does not have damage to the frontal lobe. Then on April the 4th, 1861, Bouillot's son-in-law, Ernest Aubertin, argued for the frontal localization of language with the famous spatula case at the Anthropological Society of Paris and challenged anyone to produce evidence to the contrary. Well, the spatula case was probably not that well known in the literature, but the story was that a gentleman in Paris was trying to die by suicide using a handgun. He held the gun to his head, but was not experienced with a gun. If you've ever fired a gun, which I don't expect you have, but being from the Midwest, I also have done that. When you fire a gun, there's something called recoil. The gun jumps back. So the gun jumped back when he fired it, and he succeeded in removing the left frontal skull bone completely from his brain. However, it didn't damage the brain one bit. He's in the emergency room in Paris, and Aubertin is examining him. He takes a surgical spatula while he's talking to the patient. Remember, the brain does not have pain receptors, only the dura does. So he compresses the left frontal lobe, and the patient stops talking to him. He removes the spatula and he talks again. He pushes it down. He stops talking. He removes it. He talks again. He says, aha, this must be frontal language localization. Broca was in the audience 6 days before he met Taine. Where did he get the idea, you may wonder? Broca may have missed a chance to describe behavioral changes that we know accompany expressive aphasia. We're people with anterior aphasia frequently get cataclysmic depression and get very agitated. But he didn't describe that. Broca was a pathologist. He was a surgeon. He was an anthropologist, but he was not big on psychosocial histories. He did describe Taine as being egoistic, vindictive, and mean, but he didn't notice that his patient had been voluntarily transferred to psychiatry for 9 months in the year 1852, and that was because of a medical record error, it turns out. He did decide to preserve Taine's brain for later study, and we still are able to study it. And Harlow's second description of Gage changes. Why? Why does it change 21 years after his first description? Because Broca presents the case for localization of brain function using Tintin in Paris in 1862, and apparently Harlow was aware of it. So now he reports it as specific personality changes due to that specific brain damage. But Broca also suggested, he's very little known about this, that neuroplasticity might explain recovery from aphasia. He thought the right hemisphere could take on some left hemisphere tasks. Nevertheless, Broca was a skeptic about localization of brain function in general, and certainly didn't believe everything could be localized. I'm afraid we have to leave the 1860s. We have to quickly go forward in time 40 years after Broca met Tintin to 1901, when a doctor named Alois Alzheimer, working in the laboratories of Emil Kraepelin, meets Frau D, his famous initial case. And that's Frau D. Her real name is Auguste Dieter. She was 51 years old, and on November the 25th of the year 1901, her husband brought her to the Institute for the Mentally Ill and Epileptics in Frankfurt, the Staatliche Heilanstalt für Ihren Epileptisch, because she had developed pathological jealousy, progressing to paranoid psychosis and screaming when anyone approached. Her memory had deteriorated. Alzheimer always did a careful examination, and he found her to have fluent, empty speech with paraphasias. That means she would try to say one word, but another word would come out. She had poor comprehension, poor reading, poor writing. She had agnosia, she had apraxia, and she died 4.5 years later on April the 9th, 1906. So let's look at 1901 when Alzheimer met Frau D for the first time. Well, 8 years, 9 years earlier, in Prague, a Czech neuropsychiatrist named Arnold Pick had described frontal dementia. Just about 6 years earlier, Franz Nissl, another neuropsychiatrist, had invented a kind of stain that allowed you to see neurons under the microscope. The X-ray had just been invented 6 years earlier. And 5 years earlier, Emil Kraepelin had said, let's call this disorder dementia praecox, the disorder we now know as schizophrenia. Ivan Pavlov described classical conditioning only 4 years earlier. And the year before Frau D's case was brought to the attention of Alois Alzheimer, Freud had published on the interpretation of dreams. Now, Nissl and Alzheimer worked together at the Stadtisch, at the Irrenschloss, the institution where Alzheimer met Frau D. They worked together at the asylum, and later they worked with Kraepelin. And of course, Alzheimer used a different stain. He didn't use Nissl stains to study his patient. He used Bilkowski stains. And by the way, Arnold Pick described frontal dementia, but it was Alois Alzheimer who described the inclusions that became known as Pick bodies. He thought they should be named after Pick. And by the way, this is the very first drawing of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease done by Gaetano Perosini, who was the postdoctoral student in Alzheimer's laboratory. He was a student there, and he made this drawing. Alzheimer made 250 slides of Frau D's brain. He used silver staining, and he demonstrated that there were extracellular plaques. Those were already known to occur. That's the amyloid plaques. But for the very first time, he also showed intracellular neurofibrillary tangles of tau filaments. Basically, we didn't know it was tau then. And he put aside Frau D's slides so that future physicians could study them. By the way, Alzheimer's doctoral thesis, believe it or not, was on the wax-producing glands of the ear. I'm not kidding. So Alzheimer said that through histological examination, we will gradually get to a clinical distinction of specific psychiatric illnesses. Franz Nissl, talking about Alzheimer's, says, first and foremost, he was a psychiatrist who strove to advance psychiatry by using a microscope. Kraepelin was very conscious of who gets to name what disease. And since Alzheimer was working in his laboratory later, Kraepelin says, let's call it Alzheimer's disease. And that was the beginning of that. Then on November the 3rd, 2006, at the Southwest Germany Psychiatric Society meeting in Tübingen, Alzheimer presents his paper called On an Unusual Malady of the Cerebral Cortex, and he presents the clinical and pathological findings of Frau Dieter. Only 88 psychiatrists were in the room. No one asked any questions. They were more interested in getting an early seat for the paper that was to follow Alzheimer, the paper on compulsive masturbation. But what do we learn from Frau D? Well, Alzheimer thought he had described a rare dementia. And in fact, when I go back to the year 1975 and search the available medical literature, up until 1975, from 1906 to 1975, only 40 papers had been published in all of medicine that used the term Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer did not describe an elderly patient with memory loss. He described a middle-aged patient with psychosis and memory loss. And this person likely had the presenilin 1 mutation. Later, it was shown she probably did. And Alzheimer's disease may present as a psychiatric disorder, but typically in the inherited forms like Frau Dieter had. Let's move forward in time to the year 1926, 25 years after Alzheimer met Frau Dieter. A young reporter in Moscow named Solomon Shereshevsky, known in the literature as S, met the famous Russian neuropsychologist Alexander Luria. So Shereshevsky was a 29-year-old reporter for a Moscow newspaper. there was going to be some important event in Moscow. The editor of the newspaper had all of the writers around him, journalists around him, and gave them the briefing for the day. They all had their notebooks with them and they're taking notes about what they're going to be doing and what was going to happen. But there was Chernyshevsky just sitting there, hands behind his head, I guess, listening to the editor. 20 minutes later, the editor finishes the morning briefing, sends everybody out, but he says, Chernyshevsky, you stay here. Why aren't you taking notes? And Chernyshevsky proceeds to repeat back verbatim every single word that the editor had said over 20 minutes. And he says, that the editor says, what? And Chernyshevsky says, can't everyone do this? He had eidetic memory. The editor's response was, you need to see a psychologist. And he happened to know a psychologist named Luria, who was studying brain function, and referred him to Luria. And for the next 30 years, Luria, who was a little younger than Chernyshevsky, would study Chernyshevsky and study his memory. If you're interested in reading the story, there is a book by Luria that's been translated into many languages called The Mind of a Mnemonist. This is Alexander Romanovich Luria, and this is the year 1926. It was 5 years earlier that the Rorschach test had been described. It was 3 years earlier that another neuropsychiatrist named Joseph Capgras described the delusional syndrome that bears his name. And the next year, Manfred Sakel, fortunately not a neuropsychiatrist, we claim no responsibility, invented insulin shock therapy for psychosis. Kemal Atatürk was now the president of Turkey, the first president of Turkey as a republic. The television had just been invented. And in Worcester, Massachusetts, where University of Massachusetts Medical School is, about a mile and a half from the medical school, that year, a physics professor named Goddard launched the very first liquid-propelled rocket that went into space and then came back down. And so the Goddard Space Flight Center in the United States, where they launch rockets, is named after him. So I had to put a little Worcester advertisement in. Chernyshevsky had perfect recall. Luria could find no apparent limit to what he could memorize. And it didn't matter if he was asked to say things forward or backward. It was just as easy for him. Now, this is him, by the way, writing a list of numbers that he had remembered. You know, he would do this work as a mnemonist in front of audiences, as a professional memorizer, I guess. But he had prosopagnosia. He said faces were different for him in different lights or when they had different moods, so he didn't recognize them as the same person. He memorized the details of faces in order to learn them, but he just could not match a face with a name. And when Luria asked him about this, it was simply because to him, a face was so dramatically different if it had a different expression or in different light that it wasn't the same face. He could not read while he was eating because the flavors of the food would overpower his ability to follow the text. He was a synesthete. He would learn by synesthesia. When Chernyshevsky would read something, he would hear it, he would smell it, he would taste it, he would feel it. When he saw something, he would also hear it, smell it, taste it, feel it. When he heard something, it would be in all the other senses. He had very powerful synesthesia. And as long as there was a short pause between each thing he was told, he could remember any amount of information. Yet he was confused by metaphor and abstract expressions. And he could not deduce the relationships among words. So this is from Luria's book. This is one of the things he asked him to memorize. It's a nonsense equation. He just would write it on the board. Chernyshevsky would look at it, and then he would erase it. And Chernyshevsky would be able to tell it right back to him, or he could do it the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year. It didn't matter. It was there for good. He would read him long lists of Russian phonemes, ma, va, na, sa, na, va, etc. And it didn't matter how long the list was, and you can see how similar these phonemes are. Yet Shenishevsky would repeat them exactly, and it didn't matter how long. But when Luria showed him this list of numbers and asked him to predict what the next line would be, he couldn't do it. Could not see the relationships. He could remember them, but he couldn't see the relationships between them. And of course, this would be a very simple thing to do for you to list the next list. What did we learn from Shereshevsky, the mnemonist? Well, prodigious skill in one area of cognitive function can come at tremendous cost in another area. And Luria didn't just study the deficits, he studied the whole person. And he studied him for over 30 years, followed him as long as he could, reported everything he could because he recognized this was an important case. Well, 1926 has been great, but we have to move ahead a few years to 1933. And this is a case, even if you have heard of some of the cases, you might not have heard of this one, the most famous child neuropsychiatry case in history. This is a man who was known in the literature as JP. 7 years after Luria met Shereshevsky, a child psychiatrist named Spafford Ackerley in Louisville, Kentucky, met his most famous patient, JP. It was November 1933. This is Spaff Ackerley. He went by Spaff, a very well-trained child psychiatrist. He gets a call from an attorney working with the parents of a 20-year-old boy named JP, who apparently had been stealing cars. And the question was, could Dr. Ackerley help keep JP out of jail because he was a compulsive car thief? Let's look at the year 1933. Well, that was quite a year in the world, right? That was the year that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. It was the year that Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States. It was I see we have Vargas as president of Brazil then. And sometimes there's Brazilian audiences that I've talked with, so had Vargas there. But just a few years earlier, Julius Wagner Jauregg had gotten the Nobel Prize. Not a proud moment for neuropsychiatry. You can ask me about it later if you have a question. But he was the first Nobel Prize for psychopharmacology because he is the one who discovered that giving malaria to people with neurosyphilis would cure their tertiary syphilis by fevers. He forgot to mention to the patients that he was testing that he was giving them malaria, of course. 3 years later, Egas Moniz in Portugal would pioneer the frontal lobotomy. 2 years later, Ward Halstead, who was chair of psychology at the University of Chicago, would open the very first neuropsychology laboratory. His student, Ralph Reitan, you might remember the Halstead-Reitan neuropsychological battery, is also well known. The electroencephalogram had just been invented 4 years earlier by Hans Berger, and you may know that Hans Berger eventually died by suicide and has a very complicated history. And the stretch reflex, the deep tendon reflex or the muscle reflex, had only just been described as well. So this is JP as a boy. Now, these pictures have never been published. I've done a lot of diving into this case. But JP was born on December the 29th, 1912. He was a huge baby, 11 and a half pounds, which is roughly, what is that? 2.5 kilograms, something like that. Big baby. 22-hour labor at home, and the birth required forceps assistance. So it was a difficult delivery also. But he seemed normal. And from the age of 2.5, he began to what was described as wander. He was a wanderer. What did that mean? Well, he would leave the house on his own, and he would walk up to a mile away until someone found him and brought him to the police, and they would somehow get him home. So he used to have to keep information with him about his address. And he was known as Little Lord Chesterfield. Now, you probably don't know Lord Chesterfield. Here he is. Chesterfield was known as kind of a diplomat's diplomat. He was an 18th century English diplomat who was very good at telling stories, telling humorous stories, but also using the right words to extract the diplomatic favors that he needed from someone. He was considered a master of manners. And little Lord Chesterfield, JP, had very good manners. I think his father forced it into him. A peculiar thing began to happen. In elementary school, in his first grade, little JP takes a pot of paint and defecates in it. In second grade, he takes one of his classmates' gloves and boots and defecates in those and then puts the glove back in the coat. Then he's caught exposing himself to two little girls. And when he's caught by the teacher, he stands up at attention, looks at the teacher in the eyes, and says, "I beg your pardon, sir." Well, he was then transferred to a special school. He had psychological testing at that point. His reading skills were good. His memory was very good. Had bad math skills. He ended up repeating the fourth and fifth grades. He was known as a boastful, bossy kid who took advantage of littler kids. He was extremely unpopular. The other children would wait for him after school and beat him up. His behavior, though, at home was much better than at school. Then at his new school, he was caught stealing money from a girl, caught masturbating in class, and was transferred this time to a school for, quote, defective children. And at age 13, in the year 1926, he presented to the Louisville Mental Hygiene Clinic, where they, on intake, said he has no friends, he lies, he steals. In the neighborhood, he is known for having, quote, bad sex habits, whatever that meant, probably masturbation, I'm not sure. He had no sense of fairness, no sense of sportsmanship. They diagnosed him with juvenile psychopathy, and they diagnosed his parents as mishandling him. Yet adults were always charmed by his Chesterfieldian manners. Well, he started stealing the cars of family and friends. His father was a car salesman. I think that had something to do with it. And he did very well in a little private school class. But then when he went to public high school, his behavior came back. Now he was transferred. His family had some money and they put him in a Catholic school, which in the United States is, a parochial or private school system. And he liked the discipline of the Catholic school, but he never came to school. He was truant, so he was transferred. But this time, his family and the guidance team at the school thought he would do better to be in a military school. So they sent him to another state, the state of Indiana, to go to a military school. And once he got there, he stole the teacher's car and was sentenced to 2 years in what we used to call reform school. That's the prison for children, more or less. And he gets out of that prison, and then he wanders hundreds of miles in the middle of the United States. He hitchhikes, gets a ride this way. He steals cars, and then he would drive the cars in whatever direction they were facing until they ran out of fuel. He would call his mother and said, "Mother, I did it again. I stole a car." Then his father would pay the family who owned the car in order to get them to drop any police charges. JP said, "I steer by the compass. I never make turns." He would go straight ahead. He would never turn. He would use a compass. He'd keep going in whatever direction the car was facing. But by 1933, when he was 20 years old, the authorities did press charges themselves. They had had it with him. He had stolen so many cars in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. Well, he was admitted to Louisville General Hospital and had an exploratory neurosurgery because his pneumoencephalogram, which you see here, showed very little frontal lobes. Now, you don't see pneumoencephalograms anymore. I think I might have seen the last one in Boston in 1983. But what happens is the person has air injected through a spinal tap, air injected into the spine, and then the table they're on is tilted so that when their head is facing up, the air goes up and it goes wherever there's no brain. So you can see here in this picture from 1936, his pneumoencephalogram, there's a lot of air where there should be frontal lobes. It should be white like this. So he was found to have massive destruction of prefrontal lobes. The neurosurgeon who then did the exploratory surgery said there's no right frontal lobe and very little left. He means prefrontal, I think, and very little left frontal lobe. Ackerley intervened and the charges were dropped, so he didn't go to prison. This is Paul Esslinger, a neuropsychologist, who did a reconstruction of what the brain must have looked like based on the pneumoencephalographic data. He did this in 2004. Now, JP would get along very well with other people superficially. He was a very nice guy, but he had no sense of the past and no sense of the future. He couldn't really participate in school. He couldn't form cooperative relationships, couldn't live on his own. He lived with his mother as long as he could. He couldn't keep a job. He didn't benefit from either positive or negative experience. You couldn't scare him. It didn't matter. He wasn't afraid of punishment, and he also wasn't trying to get rewards. He was kind of antisocial like, but he certainly wasn't antisocial, and he certainly had impaired moral reasoning. What do we learn from him? This is a picture of him the year he died, by the way. Well, we learned that early life prefrontal damage, in another paper we did, we showed he had a probable torn sagittal sinus from his complicated delivery, that early life prefrontal damage produces lifelong personality deficits that may only become really obvious when you need those functions during maturation. His deficits were much more severe and antisocial-like than, for instance, Phineas Gage's that were acquired prefrontal damage in adulthood. This was the first case of childhood prefrontal destruction and what it did to his personality. JP was kind of a gentleman car thief that got along very well with people for the most part. And this is a painting of Dr. Ackerley, because while I was researching this case down in Kentucky and going through Ackerley, who had died, I was going through his archives, I learned an amazing fact. Dr. Ackerley was actually my predecessor as the training director in Worcester 66 years before I became training director. But we have to jump ahead now to the year 1953. This is a patient you might have heard of, HM. And in 1953, 20 years after Spaff Ackerley met JP, a neurosurgeon in Hartford, Connecticut, here in the United States, named William Beecher Scoville, met a remarkable patient that you know as HM. We now know his name was Henry Molaison. But let's look at 1953, when Mahmut Celal Bayar was the president of Turkey. I'm not sure anyone remembers him anymore. The DSM-1 had come out the year before. Truman announced the hydrogen bomb that year. REM sleep was discovered. The structure of DNA was discovered. It was quite a year in medicine. On September the 1st of 1953, HM underwent surgery for epilepsy by William Beecher Scoville. It turns out that he had been hit by a bicycle as a child and had a 5-minute loss of consciousness. By age 10, he had developed seizures. Scoville had developed a new procedure as an alternative to the prefrontal lobotomy in schizophrenia, and decided to try the procedure on this patient because unilateral medial temporal lobectomies were being done with success for seizure control at the Montreal Neurological Institute in Quebec in Canada. So he figured he would do bilateral because this fellow had seizures coming from both medial temporal lobes. Well, the seizures got better, but HM developed nearly complete anterograde amnesia, meaning he couldn't learn anything new. This is an MRI of his brain in 1997, and you can see where there should be hippocampus, there's just black. So this is the part of the brain that was removed. Now, a neuropsychologist named Brenda Milner examined him and followed him for the rest of her career. She's still alive, by the way. She's at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And by the way, she's 106 and a half years old. She'll be 107 in July. And she's still working, still writing. She released a video on her 106th birthday. But she did this interesting test with him, had him reach through a box, looking in a mirror so that he could not see his hand except in the mirror. And he was supposed to take a pencil and trace this 5-pointed star. Of course, it's very difficult when you're looking in the mirror to do that. And he would say, I've never seen this before and I can't do it. But over a period of several weeks, He became better and better at it, even though he would say, I've never seen this before, could not do this. And he was able to do it, thus proving that even though he had lost his memory, his ability to learn new facts, new words, new things like that, remember new things that had happened in his life, he could nevertheless do motor learning, meaning that motor learning, procedural learning, is not in the hippocampus, it's in another part of the brain altogether. And we learned from him that the hippocampus is where the brain stores its declarative memory maps, but that procedural memory is stored someplace else. And there is Susanna Corkin, who's now passed away, was Dr. Milner's postdoc. And that's Brenda Milner. We gave a talk together in 2014. I was able to get a good picture of her then. So there are a number of other important cases to study in neuropsychiatry. There's not just these 6. You can find references for all of these in our paper, but remember these 6, that Phineas Gage did partially recover despite overwhelming frontal damage, that expressive language is lateralized, but also that there is a phenomenon called neuroplasticity that can aid in the recovery from aphasia, that early Alzheimer's disease can start with psychosis, especially in the family and the familial kind, but others as well. That perfect memory comes at a tremendous social cost, that our prefrontal cortex is essential for our humanity, and that procedural memory is different in the brain than declarative memory. And these are the 6 people who described these cases: Harlow, Broca, Alzheimer, Luria, Ackerley, and Milner. The microscopes indicate the cases where they attempted to preserve parts of the brain for us to study or parts of their testing for us to study. And the calendars indicate the doctors who followed their patients for the rest of their lives. The only reason that Alzheimer and Broca don't have calendars is their patients died and very soon after meeting, and they presented the results of the pathology. Well, this is Jean-Martin Charcot, considered the father of neurology. And he started medical school the year that Harlow reported Gage. He began working at the Salpêtrière in Paris the year that Broca reported Le Borgnier. Charcot, like a number of prominent neurologists, felt that he was a little better equipped to diagnose psychiatric patients than his psychiatric colleagues, but he was a big believer in the anatomical clinical method, the correlation of careful patient description with careful description of the lesion. And he paved the way for Alzheimer's report of August Dieter, for Ackerley's description of JP, for Brenda Milner's study of HM. And he gave us a template we would do well not to forget, that careful description of symptoms correlated with biological markers, for instance, functional connectome imaging, personalized genomic analysis, leads to new understanding of disease. Well-studied cases have driven our field forward. The publication of a carefully constructed case report should not simply be seen as a job for your medical students. And these are my collaborators on this project: Lindsay McGilvery in Toronto, Barbara Schildkraut at Harvard, Margot Lauterbach in Baltimore at the Shepard Pratt Institute, Len Levin at Harvard Medical School, and Alexis Cohen-Oram, who was my fellow then, now at the University of South Florida. And this URL, or this QR code on the lower right, will take you to the paper we published if you are interested. Thank you very much. And I'll stop the share here. And there's time, I guess, for a question or two if anyone's interested.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sheldon. I think I can't describe like how much I enjoyed from this presentation. At the start, as I mentioned, like I'm really fond of like Oliver Sacks, and I really enjoyed when I was studying his like cases like musicophilia and like the man mistake his like wife as a hat and all of this. And I think that's really precious, like to analyze them in a deeply way and try to really catch the factors that matter a lot, like comparing to even like writing like big meta-analyses, like case studies are also really essential. So I want to thank you a lot. And if someone have a question, please just you can go and ask.
not a question, but I would like to share my feelings of admiration. Thank you very much, Sheldon. This has been an extraordinary session, which I believe, uh, for myself at least, I need to go over the recording and try to digest all you have presented. Really, thank you so much. I hope we can hear you in another meeting as well for our seed activities.
Irem has her hand up.
Yes, it's not a question, but I also would like to thank you for this presentation. It was a very insightful and good presentation. I also agree with Dr. Joshkun. Like each of the cases were like a whole presentation, and I also want to like rewatch it and think about it. And I also would like to say that I mean during medical school. I'm a psychiatry resident, by the way. It's my second year during the medical school and residency. These cases, these people, names of these people are told to us. Like there was, for example, Phineas Cage, and he had damage in frontal lobe damage, and that was all. Uh, and while listening to you, I was like, it was a real person, and it was a real history, and it was very challenging, and it was very good to hear the behind the scenes and all the things, because and I think it would be like interesting for medical students during the medical lectures and all the things, also for example students in the high school, blah blah, to listen this kind of stories, to get more interested in both psychiatry and neuroscience and medicine, because other than that we are like just listening some things, trying to memorize them. But by listening this kind of things, it's like they're real people, and there was these discoveries sometimes, and it is really important. Thank you for this presentation.
It's very kind of you, Irem. And by the way, Dr. Juskin and I go back, I don't know, quite a while, a decade, maybe 15 years, I don't know. He was running the section of education for the World Psychiatric Association, and got involved with that group, and we got to know one another. But I've not yet uh, been in person to visit, even though I've tried, it has not worked out. So,
By the way, let me share with you another thing. We have a psychiatrist group in Turkey, and there Emel and Salman Kayatekin, as mentioned, having worked with you together with Kaan. And
oh, oh, you know
they,
Kanos Bayrak and Salman Kayatikin.
yeah,
Oh
yeah,
yeah, great people.
I'm sure they will follow, they will see this recording as well. We have Ece Orhon from that group, but she hasn't opened her video, so we don't see him on YouTube. Ece abla, could
Kanos
you please?
Bayrak was one of my residents years ago, many
Yeah,
years ago.
yeah, some years ago.
Yeah.
I believe other friends may ask, Deren, Bartu.
I don't have a question, but I would also like to thank you for this presentation. I really liked the explanation of the timeline. I
Yeah.
really liked that.
Yeah. When you read or when you're taught something, go back in the literature and try to find the paper yourself. And don't believe what your teachers tell you without doing that. Uh, Go back and read it for yourself and make up your own mind. And if something's not clear, look up each of the references to that paper and read that. And when that's not clear, go back and read the references in that paper until you get back to the very first germination of the idea, and you can understand where things come from that you're learning in school. So,
Or go and ask Benjamin Sheldon. he can tell you what the problem is.
Yeah. We call this in English slang, we refer to this as going down the rabbit hole, uh, like in Alice in Wonderland, where you just so the case of JP, I got particularly interested in because I first read those papers when I was a behavioral neurology fellow in 1985, and returned to the case when we wrote this paper. I got interested again and spent 6 years going back trying to find out what happened to him and to find his brain and study it because it was never published. And we succeeded in finding the brain and publishing it. So you can find a paper where we tell the entire life story of JP. It was published last year or the year before, maybe. This entire crazy expedition that I did for this obsessional thing for 6 years. So have fun with medical history.
Yeah, does anyone have any question? I can maybe could ask like because you just seldomly like passed over it, the persons that put like give malaria to the persons that have syphilis is. You say
Ah,
that maybe I have never heard it, so it was really like
all right. This is not a proud moment in the history of neuropsychiatry. So Julius Wagner Jorig was the head of the neuropsychiatry laboratory in Vienna. And you might know that in the 19th century, about 15% of patients in public mental hospitals were actually there because they had syphilis in the frontal lobes, neurosyphilis. We used to call it GPI, or general paresis of the insane. And there was no psychopharmacology back then, remember? And he discovered that he first, I think it was first noticed that when people had a high fever, their syphilis improved. So he thought he would give people high fevers by injecting them with serum from the blood of patients with malaria. But there was no informed consent. So um, he just got all these patients to come in and gave them malaria without explaining that he was going to give it. He just said, I'm going to cure your bad blood. So he did succeed in showing that fevers treated neurosyphilis. And he got the Nobel Prize for what you could argue was the first Nobel Prize in psychopharmacology, because this treatment was the beginning of a movement that enabled us to discharge patients from the mental hospitals because their syphilis would improve. But clearly, it was not a very ethical um, standard he was living by. So important, but a little bit of an embarrassment.
yeah, I see. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
If there's no any other question, we can, I think, conclude our meeting for today. Again, thank you so much a lot. And yeah, Dr. Blunt, you can.
Okay, great. I'll stay on the line, Bolio.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Thank you everyone for participation.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. It's our duty to watch this YouTube recording. It's our duty. Thank you. I'm closing the session now.